I just wanted to thank you guys for the opportunity to present the Pause and Reflect Toolkit. It's actually a product of a lot of people, and several of those people are on the call now. So it's really nice to be able to share this product with you guys. So this is just the rundown. It's not going to take 30 minutes. So Nick, I hope you have a lot more to say. I can cede you some time. Just to overall welcome, we're going to explore this tool a bit. I'm going to take advantage of trying to hear from you guys about other tools that you would find useful, and then just have a polling question for you guys at the very end as well. So this is where I would love it if you could get into the Google slide deck and the link that I shared, and then just share some feedback with me, please, about how many of you have participated in a Pause and Reflect workshop. Just grab a dot and move it over to the yes or the no. And also, if you don't know what in the world I'm talking about when I say Pause and Reflect, I'd love to know that too.
I can refresh, but I'm only on view only. I don't know about that.
Okay. So
me too. I can see it all and I'm in there, but I can't move anything.
oh, I wonder why that
is. I like the what are you talking about though?
Well, maybe you guys can just come off mute if it's not going to work in the slide deck. How many
Hey,
of
Megan,
you?
can you go into the share in the upper right-hand corner? There's share. And then can you change it to anyone with the link, his editor? And that should solve the problem.
Wonderful.
And people may need to refresh their screens if that doesn't work.
Okay, now we see some movement.
I can do it.
So I was also really curious from, inside AID, the reason I'm asking this question is it's kind of a new concept for us. I think it came up maybe halfway through MI2. So that must have been like 2019, maybe 2020. It just became a thing, right? And so now it happens all the time, really frequently. But it looks like some of you haven't, and at least one person doesn't know what I mean by pause and reflect.
And Megan, it did evolve from after action reviews within the military and within emergency rooms and ambulance services where they basically used the same tool, but they called it after action reviews. So, but I agree, it's a kind of new thing.
Yeah, and I think it was probably it's probably no yes or no like this is set up. It's sometimes somewhere in the middle where I think teams would often have retreats or have meetings where you might talk about your activity or your project, but it wasn't necessarily a thing that you did on a regular basis. So thanks for sharing that with me. I just wanted to see how you all have experienced pause and reflect sessions. So what I'm going to talk about today is really the product of the Measuring Impact and Measuring Impact 2 projects that USAID has invested in since all the way back to, I think, 2013, 14, and over 10 years of experience in adaptive management and biodiversity conservation. And like I said, there were a lot of people who worked on this product, and several of you are on the call, and it's really a lessons learned document from over 90 different sessions of pausing reflect. So it's really an honor to share all of this work with you. So the team that put this together, I was the activity manager here within USAID. Ash Baker at Foundations of Success was my counterpart, along with Kelsey Schuler, Regina Harlig at Environmental Incentives. And then also our regional mission in South America was an active partner with us and helped both fund and prepare one of the products in this toolkit. And one of the most important kind of concepts that we wanted to talk about it that you alluded to, David, was that there are many ways of pausing and reflecting, and they're really based on a lot of experience, both in the CMP and CCNet community, that we were able to draw upon the Conservation Essentials course, the products around light recipes for conservation and making better decisions. So we're able to really use the experience from this community, and also with the help of our South America colleagues, it's also, all of these tools are in Spanish as well. So I don't know how many of you might be familiar with USAID's framework around collaboration, learning, and adapting, but kind of rooted in that framework of adaptive management, this toolkit provides templates and example materials about how to facilitate pause and reflects, so that implementing partners or donors or whoever is really interested in supporting this work can find a place to start. And if you're in the slide deck, you can probably click on the links or use your phone and get to this research using these QR codes. The starting point, which is probably a little bit unwieldy here on a slide deck as a visual, but this is the navigation pane of this toolkit. And really the first place to start is on this design worksheet. And that will help you make decisions about where is really the best place to start, since you have lots of options about how you might go about doing this. It will take you through a series of questions that will help you figure out what's the best thing for your situation. Again, you can download the worksheet, make a copy of it, and kind of walk yourself through the questions. I'm not going to click on the resources now because that will just take us down too many rabbit holes, I think, but hopefully you can go to the site and go through it at your leisure. Again, once you've kind of thought about it from the design point of view, we prepared a set of checklists, kind of how you can designate roles and responsibilities with your team, give you some agendas with annotations about this might work best in this situation, or maybe another option for how to facilitate a session, how you go about finding qualified facilitators for your work, and then also learn from a common set of problems that have come up in the past. Then again, going through the navigation pane, you can find a set of tools that we've found useful when going through pause and reflect exercises. And one of those is really one of my favorites is the stoplight diagram. And I think I like stoplight diagrams the most because of it really connects your results chain to your activities. And I think the idea of a traffic light is something that a lot of different people can relate to, that red, yellow, green of, yes, this is working, no, it's not working, or this is really something that we should stop doing. It also provides some slide decks so that you can get a good starting point and customize. It goes through the different uses of Mural and Miro, and then also provide some facilitation resources that you can kind of use as a one-stop shop. And then, because nothing stops just when you do a pause and reflect, there's always lots of follow-ups that's needed. So we show some example of reports and also some after action reviews. So your facilitation team or your project team can think about kind of how it helped you or how it didn't help you and how you can use that in the future. So another a fundamental part of this toolkit is what we call the Good Practices Guide. It's much more of a narrative document, kind of in the style of our how-to guides. And this is really a product from the South America regional people. In MI2 in particular, I don't know if I've ever counted up quite as many pause and reflects that they did with all of their activities, but they had what they called pause and reflect season, where literally they were doing workshop after workshop after workshop. And that mission really wanted to document the lessons learned. And so that's what this product is. So again, something more about something you can read rather than an actual a tool. Again, and it really walks you through who needs to be involved, like how do you engage all the right stakeholders in your project, kind of what data and materials do you need to be successful, and then what are some key issues that you might have to resolve. So it helps you think through the process. Look forward to that. So in this one, I really wanted to focus on the most common challenges and solutions that we would often see in pause and reflects. And the first one was that the scoping point of view of not always knowing where to start. And so that's what led us to do the worksheet. And then another common challenge was how to organize information or keep track of all the data that you need. And especially from year to year, because some teams will actually do these workshops every year and really put the information to work as part of their work planning. And by using this kind of workbook, it will help you keep everything in the life of your project all in one place. And then another kind of common challenge that we found was being able to clarify roles and responsibilities in the team members. And in this case, really that role of a neutral facilitator often came up, and then the role of just agreeing who was going to do what. It's always the things that seem the most obvious that sometimes can be a challenge, particularly when you might have multiple teams or multiple organizations coming in to do a workshop and not always articulating what their expectations are. By having a team charter, it gets you to really clarify who's going to do what and when. And then often, like our last challenge that we often found was that follow-up and reporting. And so I think that's what led us to really want to make sure to provide some templates for that. So just my key takeaways from this is this toolkit is a product of a lot of people and a lot of experience of doing pause and reflect workshops. And we hope that this collection of resources will help you along your journey to include adaptive management in your biodiversity projects. And then, because I'm going to take advantage of having the microphone in this particular session, I wanted to see if you would be willing to share some feedback for us in terms of now, Measuring Impact 2 has finished, but we have a new program that's called Ideal. We are still focusing on adaptive management and learning and improving the practice of conservation. Kind of what tools would be helpful for you? So if you could dive back into that slide deck, I would love to hear either any questions that you have on using this toolkit, or also just kind of like where in that adaptive management process, where you might see opportunities of where we in Ideal could work with you.
It looks like Giselle has her hand up.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, Megan. Thank you so much. I'm super excited to look through this. A quick question. I was looking at the Pause and Reflect Design worksheet, and I saw you had one that said USAID portfolio reviews. That's a portfolio level review of activities. Can you just describe a little bit what that is? Just curious. And then it says other higher level reviews. Is that more like impact analysis and attribution and contribution kind of questions?
The portfolio reviews are within kind of USAID government speak, a process that we go through annually, where internally, it's definitely an internal exercise. USAID managers will look at their portfolios, usually sector by sector, office by office. And I'll be completely honest, I don't always see adaptive management or these kind of tools applied. It's something that we've started to talk about a lot. It tends to have a very financial bent to it, and not always focused on outcomes and not always focused on learning. So even internally within our own culture, I think we have a lot of work to do to make those a real pause and reflect moment rather than just a management check-in. But that's what that is referring to. It could be an opportunity to pause and reflect. It's just not always used as in a pause and reflect way, more potentially in a management or strategy way. The I'm really happy that you brought up contribution and attribution analysis, and that is really one thing that we are doing a lot of under IDEAL is really trying to strengthen our focus on impact evaluation in all its many ways, understanding the challenges that randomization might bring to biodiversity conservation, but even if it's just really making our monitoring, evaluation, and learning programs even more rigorous so that we can do a better job of connecting attribution and contribution to this particular contribution to our work.
Thank you, Mike.
Even in the challenges of complexity. Wow, I'm seeing so much. Thank you all so much for these inputs.
Becky, you have your hand up too.
Yeah, I just have a question. I haven't had like a deep look into these resources, though they look amazing. But here's my question. If you are midway in a project or taking a team through conservation standards process, and then you wanted to implement something like this, is there something, like you talked about like the entry point to do this, but is there something that is worth setting up at the start? Like, if you know you're going to do a pause and reflect, is there a certain way at the very outset with your team that you would set things up versus like retroactively making the decision to start something like this and then doing it?
Yeah, I would invite some of the participants here to chime in as well. You know, in my perspective is like any time in the implementation of a project is a good time to pause and reflect. It might look really different depending on where you're at and how much pre-work you've done. The colleagues with MI2 and with IDEAL have done a lot of work in terms of recreating theories of change when they didn't exist at the beginning, like taking a looking at your project documents and helping you identify and name the assumptions that you're making, like this outcome will lead to that result. So you can do that retroactively, even if you didn't do that at the beginning. We find that there are kind of common, and we talk about it in the guide, so you can read more about it there, that activity startup is an opportunity to really examine some of the design assumptions that were made and make those updates. And so you can really focus much more on the logic between your outcomes and some of the assumptions that you're making. And then when you're in year 2 and 3 of an activity, it's usually a good time to be both questioning that, but then also focusing, are we collecting the data that we need? Do we have the MEL, the monitoring, evaluation, and learning information that we need? And then when you get to like year 4 and a 5, if you're in a traditional project cycle, you can focus a lot more on learning. So there are different opportunities depending on the phase of your activity implementation. But I would definitely say it's never too late, particularly if you're working on a project and you haven't developed results chains or you haven't articulated any of those assumptions in any kind of way. Really taking a moment to do that is a good opportunity.
Thanks.
And Becky and others and Megan, we see pause and reflect as a sort of way to do rapid cycle adaptive management. And so we see it, the timeframes for doing this depends on the team that you're working with. If it's a small team working together on a problem, they may do a training and immediately do a pause and reflect. So they may do a scheduled monthly pause and reflect with their government partners. They may do a 6-month pause and reflect with all the stakeholders in a workshop. And they may do a pre-annual reporting work planning pause and reflect to try and look back at their theory of change. There's lots of different frames for doing this and time frames for doing this and compositions of teams to do this. One of the things that we find really important about pause and reflect with field teams is young staff get to talk to their bosses in a comfortable, transparent way, and the bosses listen, but it takes practice. And most importantly, we've learned that don't assume that pause and reflect is something that you invoke when something bad has happened. Because unless your team has learned how to be trusting trustingly deal with pause and reflect when everything is going well. If you try to do it only when bad shit happens, it's never going to work because your team doesn't trust one another. So pause and reflect has to be a learning process where everyone learns to speak openly about what's working, what's not, and how we can make things better. But we think it's an absolutely astoundingly flexible and astoundingly useful process. So thanks, Megan.
No, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with teams and pause and reflect for that very reason of the team building and the communication, particularly when it might be a consortia of different organizations who don't work in the same offices, and they only have one part of a project and they don't understand what the other two parts are doing. It's a good opportunity to bring them in, and we've added things like doing Google surveys to people, again, just to ask the question, what should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? And what changes might have happened during the year that we should know about. And just having that opportunity for open communication is also often it's a trust building and confidence building exercise. So again, thank you so much for all of these inputs, and I will definitely pass on your input here to our ideal team about different products that we might continue to work on. While I have the floor for one more minute, I just wanted to do a pitch for biodiversitylinks.org. If you haven't already visited the site, this is our knowledge management site where I think you'll find a lot of key resources, such as our biodiversity how-to guides. We have a whole section on evidence and action, activity startup guides. Again, if you're about to launch a new activity, it kind of shows how to use adaptive management throughout your project, along with these pause and reflect guides, a series of really great resources on stakeholder engagement. One of our most popular products on Biodiversity Links is our Combating Wildlife Crime Toolkit, which has 10 different generic theories of change that you can apply to any kind of conservation crime type activity. And then also some new resources that we have on safeguards and for activities that are supporting parks and protected areas. So amongst a lot of other really interesting resources, please take a look at Biodiversity Links. And other than that, I just wanted to say thank you very much and happy pause and reflecting.
And Megan, just to say, for all the people on this call and all your colleagues, please do push them towards clicking on or getting some of the information underlying these QR codes, because there's a huge depth of very, very useful material that Megan did not have time to dive into, but all of us should take the time to dive into it. It's really a brilliant set of resources.
And Kelsey, I think you're still out there. Could you please come online or share your camera just so that you can also take the credit, because this is really Kelsey's slide deck that I just edited a bit. She presented this at the CMP retreat. So thank you very much, Kelsey.
Thanks, Kelsey. And thanks, Megan. This was really a super brief but very useful presentation. Thanks a lot. Nick, are you ready to talk about?
I am. Yep.
Great. So protected area effectiveness.
I will share
the floor
my
is yours.
Excuse me. So I'm doing this on behalf of myself and Paola Mejia, and you should see my screen. Some of you have seen some of this before, but it's a evolving thing. So hopefully I'll present for about 20 minutes of what we're up to, and then would love to get some feedback. And we're going to come and ask for your help at the end of this. So be prepared to help us. So this is about towards an outcomes-based approach for assessing the effectiveness of protected areas and to some degree OECMs, other effective conservation, area-based conservation measures. This is a task force that has been put together at the behest of Madhu Rao, who is the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. So it is a global commission charged with helping protected areas think about how to get better at what they do. And Paola and I are the co-chairs of this task force. But there are many other people involved in this work as well. So this all relates to, I'm sure you're all familiar with the CBD Target 3, which is 30 by 30. We have this ambitious aim to protect 30% of the world's lands and waters. But the highlighted part is the important part, effectively conserved and managed. So it's not just the quantity, but it's also the quality. And the key is, what do we mean by effectiveness? There are tons of people who are out there trying to climb the same mountain. There are lots of people who are working on this topic. But in particular, we see our efforts here, and I don't tell this to everybody, but I'm going to say that to this group, of bringing together two worlds. There's the whole WCPA world and people who work on protected areas around the world. And then there's the world of the Conservation Measures Partnership. And I think that we have been climbing the same mountain, but these worlds have been really split and apart. And part of our not so secret aim here is to bring these two worlds together. So here's our theory of change, because of course we have to have a theory of change if we're going to be doing this work. So our task force says that if we can compile the existing frameworks that are out there in a Rosetta Stone, which I'll share with you, and agree upon principles for a good framework and approach, and then if we can develop a consensus framework and approach and pilot test it with key systems around the world, we can develop on high-level results and indicators of how to measure outcomes. Framework tools and managers of all the other frameworks and tools that are out there can use this to fill gaps and improve their frameworks and tools. So we're not trying to create a new framework, we're trying to improve the existing ones. If we can do that, framework will be, data from existing frameworks and tools will be easily incorporated into standard assessments, so we can make sense of all the work that's already out there. PAs and OECMs will have public, credible, current, useful outcome-based effectiveness assessments. If we can do that, they can use the assessments to improve their practices and get the needed technical capacity and support. We'll have more effective PAs and OECMs and the systems that they're implementing them. And also that 30 by 30 commitments can be tracked and broader society has confidence in PAs. So this is our overall theory of change. I want to go through what we've been doing along it step by step. So the first part is compiling a Rosetta Stone of frameworks and agreeing on principles and an approach. So as I said, there are a ton of frameworks and tools out there. So a framework is a way of thinking about measuring effectiveness. One of the early ones was the PAME framework, which was developed in about early 2000s. And that's associated with certain tools, such as the MET handbook. So many of you may be familiar with the MET, which is the Management Effectiveness Tracking tool, which has been used to assess protected areas around the world. More recently, there's been the Green List Standard, version 1.1, which IUCN has promoted. And that is a framework, but there are a bunch of eagles and other people who are helping implement that in various tools. Many countries have their own versions of their frameworks for assessing effectiveness. In particular, Peru and Chile are two that we've looked a lot at. And then there's this other weird thing that some wackos kind of deal with to think about effectiveness called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation. That is another framework or set tool and set of framework that you can think about in this regard. So what we did in our Rosetta Stone is we took all those frameworks and tools and put them in their original order. What are the things that they would measure to track effectiveness, components, and results? And then more interestingly, we scrambled them against each other to sort of see where there were similarities and overlaps. So we could identify where maybe MET didn't cover a certain topic. Maybe the Green List did. These other things looked at them. We ended up looking at over 30 different frameworks and tools. So we are really trying to be exhaustive in terms of the work we did. And I can share that with you in gory detail if you want to see it. We then came up with a few principles. So principle one is that effectiveness needs to be considered at both individual and area and network levels. So an area would be a team trying to implement one or more strategies to achieve certain ends. So that's a protected area. But it also could be an indigenously managed area. It could be an OECM. There are many things that you could fit into that bucket there. And then within that, you might have a network, which is a collection of those different areas. And the system is the agency or the group of people who are charged with managing that network. So you have a PA or OECM system, and they also have higher level things that they're trying to accomplish as well. Okay. We also want to assess effectiveness in terms of both process and outcomes. And I want to use a metaphor here of two teams that are rowing. So if you have two teams that are rowing, and mind you, rowers face backwards, this is why they're going backwards, and they're on identical pieces of canal, and they go for a little bit of a race, and the gun goes off, and after time one, team A has crossed the finish line and achieved the outcome. And team B is way back there and hasn't gotten anywhere. And so I'm going to ask you as the evaluator, which of these teams is more effective? Well, obviously, team A has achieved its outcome, so they get the gold star, and team B should be fired because they're not getting anything done. But you know it's a trick question. And being conservation standards people, the trick question here is, if I gave you the additional information that this team had a current of enabling conditions that just pushed them across the line, they didn't have to do anything, they just drifted across the line, Whereas team B is rowing madly in the face of huge threats and just trying to stay in place. Then you ask the question, who's been effective? It's not so clear. And maybe effectiveness is not just about ultimate outcomes, but it's about the process that you need to do to get there. And we need to think about both of those things. It also requires setting credible and smart objectives and outcomes. And so this idea of a high bar that you have to get over to conserve your values. So that's the threshold for a given objective or outcome. Specifying the height of the bar must be determined by the area network managers during the planning process. And it represents what they need to accomplish in order to preserve their values, the things they care about. By the way, because it's the protected area world, I'm using the word values instead of conservation targets because the entire protected area world uses that word values and not targets. So we want to set credible, smart outcomes and objectives. Obviously, you set the bar too low, then it's easy to hop over it, so it's not credible. But strangely enough, if you set the bar too high, that's not feasible. And in the face of climate change, I don't think we can say that to be successful, protected area must conserve all the species that are in it today. I think we actually have to plan for climate change and set out objectives that might be more realistic. So what we need to do is set a bar that is both results-oriented, high enough to matter, and achievable, low enough to be feasible. And it also has to be specific, measurable, and time-limited so that it can be easily assessed. In other words, it's a SMART objective. And this is where the whole genesis of SMART in the open standards comes from, is setting those things so that we can look at effectiveness over time. Fourth principle is that it's not really a high bar, it's actually a set of hurdles along a theory of change. And so that if you really want to be effective, you need to get all these things in place: governance and planning, strategies implemented, threat reduction, and ultimately your values conserved. So it's working along a set of hurdles. The fifth principle is that we want to balance feasibility, usefulness, and credibility. So again, we want to have at the end of our theory of change, public, credible, current, and useful outcome-based effectiveness assessments. We want managers to use the assessments to improve their practices and get the support they need. So this is about evaluation for proving rather than for improving. Improving rather than for proving. We want to have then more effective PAs, OECMs, and systems. We also want the commitments tracked, and we want society to have confidence. So to get there, it has to be feasible to apply globally. It has to be useful to managers, and it has to be credible to supporters. So we can think about first-party assessments, second-party assessments, or third-party assessments, different ways of doing and tracking success. And there's a really interesting metaphor from the service sector, where if I want to buy a piece of software or a furniture, I can get it good and fast, but then it's going to be expensive. I can get it cheap and fast, but then it's going to be low quality. Or I can get it cheap and good, but then it's going to be slow to deliver. And the iron triangle of service delivery says it's impossible to be all three: cheap, fast, and good. You have to pick two. So we're going for three things: useful, feasible, and credible. And if we do a third-party based theory of change approach using the full-on conservation standards, well, that's useful and credible, but is it feasible to do at thousands and hundreds of thousands of protected areas around the world? If we did a non-theory of change-based approach, feasible and credible, but not so useful. And if we do a first-party theory of change approach where people say what they're doing and just attest to it, then it's feasible and useful, but it may not be credible. And so the question is that middle ground blank, or are there things that we can do with second parties and peer reviews and things like that that would allow us to actually get there? And then the sixth and most important principle is that it has to be useful and thus used by protected area and protected area system managers. This is an example of the work that Paola has been doing for the last 10 years, working with protected area managers from across Latin America to take these approaches and adopt them and implement them. And a lot of what we're doing is just borrowing from their work. And so, for example, the work in Chile and Peru. Okay, so those are our 6 principles. So we did that first. We come up with those principles. We come up with that Rosetta Stone. So then our next step is to come up with a consensus framework and approach. And this is the framework that we've come up with. And we borrowed this heavily from the Peruvians who invented it first. So that if we take a protected area or OECM area, we need to have good governance, sound design, and enabling conditions. That leads to adaptive strategy implementation. That leads to threats being reduced. That leads to the area values being conserved and human well-being and being enhanced. And that leads then there's a back loop of monitoring, evaluation, and learning that we need to do as well. So effectiveness requires both the management process. How are we doing over on that left-hand side of this chain, as well as the outcomes on the right-hand side of the chain? As you can see, the process and the outcomes overlap a bit. They're not completely clean. We can then take that a step farther and also think about the same thing at the system level, where we're going to set up system-level governance, design, enabling conditions. That leads to being able to implement the area-based work. That leads to area-based outcomes, which then leads to the system-level goals through this arrow here. And then there's a big debate about in protected area world, is there also stuff they could do at the national or system level to reduce threats that would also help them realize their goals? And then on top of this, you have the enabling conditions and global support needed. So this is our overall framework for thinking about effectiveness. When we compare it to the existing frameworks and tools, all the ones out there, a bunch of them have some major gaps. So in general, the green list, the MET, all these other ones, they're pretty good. IMET, on and on and on. They're pretty good at kind of assessing governance and design. They kind of get at the enabling conditions, but they struggle a bit with tracking strategy implementation in some way. And they particularly have issues with the outcomes of threat reduction and area and values being conserved and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. They don't have a lot of ways of assessing that. Well, who does? Oh, yeah, the Conservation Measures Partnership and the conservation standards. So I think there's a lot that we can maybe bring from the world that we're all in to this process. So our approach is to crosswalk existing tools to report on process. So if we have good governance and sound design enabling conditions, what we can do is we can create a crosswalk where, and I don't have time to go into details, but I can show you this, where we could take a MET rating or a green list rating. And in general, for example, the MET or the green list, they have similar criteria that we would in our framework. And so if you've done a MET rating or a green list rating, that generally counts for assessing governance and how things are doing. So for these governance, sound design, enabling conditions, we're not spending a ton of time on that, but we're just trying to understand how we could incorporate the existing frameworks that are out there and their assessments into this analysis. Where it gets in, and then we can track whether they've achieved these elements of the theory of change. Are they achieved, on track, partially achieved, not yet, as a way of then incorporating the scoring from those tools to come up with scoring of how we're doing overall. Where it gets more interesting is when we get into adaptive strategy implementation. So for example, here, if we look at this adaptive strategy and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So there's a very basic chain that says that we think protected areas do a bunch of simple things. One of the things they do is enforcement. So what we could do is maybe take the standardized theories of change for the most common protected area management strategies, one of them being enforcement, and we could develop a very high-level theory of change that comes from CAMEL or from all the work that we've done in the CMP, has a good enforcement plan developed, have the needed staff been trained and deployed, is enforcement equitably implemented, are potential poachers deterred, as a result of that, our illegal threat activities reduced, and our conservation values enhanced. And so that we think we could, for maybe the 5 most common strategies used by protected areas, get them to assess their progress along these kinds of basic theories of change. And what that would enable us to do is then assess whether that program, that protected area is getting there or not. If you look at the green list criteria or the MET criteria, they hint at many of these intermediate results. They have questions about, do you have the staff in place to do enforcement? They have the questions about, is enforcement equitably implemented? So they have implicit theories of change in a lot of those existing scorecards and frameworks and tools, but they haven't laid it out in a theory of change in quite this explicit a way. And so we think that that's our big innovation, is for enforcement, for visitor management, for managing legal activities within the protected area, for education, and for the general work that you do, for those things that we could actually use a high-level theory of change approach to help protected areas assess how they're doing in terms of implementing their strategies. Okay. For outcomes, so for threat reduction and for area values conserved, we also think we can lean a little bit on what the conservation standards do. If you look at the green list has a criterion that says threats have been reduced, but they don't offer any guidance within the standard itself about how you might assess that or how area values might be conserved. They do have guidance for their eagles, the people who are helping to do those assessments, but even that's pretty cursory and still being developed. So there's a huge space, there's a huge gap out there for helping people think through, how do we measure whether threats are being reduced and how do we measure whether outcomes are being achieved? And this is where we think we can draw on the conservation standards. So for example, we might be able to do, or if people have done a threats assessment and they have, or this case, a assessment of the viability of their targets, you might see here that they have their values, their wetlands, ecosystem, rainforest. If they have an initial status of poor and they specify their desired status, then maybe as an assessment, we can track the current status and the trend, and then ask how people are doing in relation to the outcome they set for themselves. So using the principles of the conservation standards to do this. If you remember the rowing analogy I gave you, you don't have to get to good or very good. You don't have to get to the finish line to get to and achieve an effectiveness rating. All you have to do is get progress towards the goals that you've specified that are credible for yourself. So that's the real trick of this, is trying to find that, set that bar in the right place and then measure your progress toward it. But we think that a lot of the conservation standards tools, such as the threshold-based assessments of value status that are in viability analysis or the threat ratings, would provide people the ability to do this and make these kinds of assessments. And so I'm going to hop out of the presentation just briefly here. One of the things we've been actually testing with a whole bunch of different practitioners here is, along the way, if we were to do that threat test, should we do the full-on viability analysis? Should we do it against the relative ratings? Is it better to measure progress against some threat reduction objective? Is it better to measure progress against an actual SMART objective that you're writing? There's a whole bunch of trade-offs about different ways of using these tools to get to a protected area effectiveness. And so we've been testing and evaluating which of these might make most sense and which are most practical to implement it in a protected area context. So there's a whole bunch of desk interviews that we've been doing with various folks, including some CMP folks, to get opinions about how we should structure these and what might make the most sense. Okay, I'm about to run out of time, but coming back to our slideshow here. So we have developed that consensus framework and approach, and now we're in the process of pilot testing this approach with key protected area and OEM systems. And as I said, there's 3 kinds of tests that we can envision. The first is a desk review, where we've been sitting down with specialists to review and comment on the components and results in our draft framework. We've done this again with CMP, with our task force, with Parks Canada, with Canadian Wildlife Service, with other folks as well. So we've been kind of doing a whole bunch of desk reviews of these tests. But what we would like to do is now move into testing this framework in real world settings. For the alpha user tests, we don't have time to create all the guidance material or all the things that people would need to test and administer the framework on their own. So we're thinking about doing it in a more facilitated workshop setting. And so alpha user tests would be, say, working with a group of protected area managers to go through in a workshop setting and try these different components and see if it would work to sort of assess the effectiveness of their protected area. So, and then to do the beta user test eventually, then we would translate the framework to the actual tools and guidance that can be used by practitioners and actually try it in a more live setting. So we're more on this alpha user test heading towards these beta user tests. So we've completed our expert desk reviews. So here's an example of all the experts from Latin America, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, Colombia, many other teams. They're all sitting there kind of commenting with their cards on the effectiveness of these different things that we used. We've done a similar online exercise with Parks Canada, Canadian Wildlife Service, with CMP, with FOS staff, and with WCMC Task Force. We are now planning our alpha tests, and we think this could be done in maybe 5 sessions of about 2 hours each, where we would present, for example, the governance design enabling conditions component of our framework in an overall plenary, and then have people try it and apply it to their protected area and breakout groups, and maybe at a system level. Similar session for strategy implementation and MEL, one for focal value outcomes, one for threat outcomes, and then general discussion and feedback. So we would like to sequence and plan a series of these tests, again with the Red Parks, with Parks Canada and Canadian Wildlife Service. We're lining something up with Bush Heritage. But we would love to find other examples of protected areas that would be willing to test and try this out. And, oh, by the way, this is fairly resource intensive. So we would love to find CMP and CCNet coaches who could actually support and help us with these tests and guide the teams through this so that we could actually have an effective test. So that's our overall theory of change of where we are, what we've been up to. I hope you see that we are climbing the same mountain as we are with CMP. I am going to turn it over briefly to Paola to see what I missed, and then we'll open it up for wider questions.
Thank you, Nick. No, I think that it was very clear. Maybe just to add that this is something that some agencies in Latin America have been really pushing to have something like this. So that's why it's really not only it's not it's not only that we are testing with some countries in the region, but I like to say that this is driven by these countries. And right now we are already starting the testing itself with CONAF. So just to share that. And yes, that it would be great to have more cases around the world and with more coaches from CMP and CCNet.
Thank you, Paola, and thank you, Nick. That was excellent. Do we have questions for Nick and Paola?
Nick, one clarifying question that came up in the chat. A couple people were just asking for what exactly it was you meant by first, second, and third party theory of change.
Sure. Let me jump to that slide. So that's for doing assessments of how a protected area is doing against a framework. And so if you're familiar with the certification world and that whole world, a first party is when I tell you what I'm doing is good. So I'm asserting that my protected area is doing a good job. A second party is when my peers review what I've done and tell the world that what I've done is good or bad. And a third party is when you have an independent outside party coming in and assessing against a set of standards. People think third party is sort of the gold standard, and maybe it is, but you don't always need to get to third party. In fact, for example, academic peer review, which we all accept as sort of a great thing, is really second party. It's not third party. And so there are many cases of where first or second party might be a totally appropriate way in which to do these things. But they have trade-offs, and so it's understanding what those trade-offs might be.
And Claire and everyone else and Nick, I think one of the biggest challenge with non-first party is the absence of information for a second or third party to make any credible assessment. So the frameworks are super, and they give protected area authorities and their collaborators a really good framing for what we should be gathering and how we should be assessing progress. The problem is the frameworks themselves give no guidance whatsoever about how you might actually gather the information needed to assess progress. And I think this is one of the biggest failures that we have. The frameworks are incredibly important as a framing of a process. But what I'm a little confused about, Nick and Paolo, is how do you do a test in incredibly data poor places, or are you only doing tests in data rich places? Because without data, I'm not quite sure how you assess whether your framework is practical or credible or not.
So I think it's a really good point, David. I think that the initial test will be easier in places like with Bush Heritage or Parks Canada, where they're already doing versions of the conservation standards or viability analysis or thinking through these things. And so kind of starting there where there is some low-hanging fruit of people who have some of the data or some of these ways to think about them, and we're just helping them organize and present them in an effectiveness context, seems to make sense. But I do think that the goal here, and I'm going to be really blunt to this team, to this group, and I hope, well, this is being recorded, but it's okay. I see this as an opportunity for us to drive the principles of the conservation standards into the global protected area world. Because I think that I hope most people on this call would agree is that it's not about the score you get, it's about the process and the thinking you're going through. And so what this is maybe an avenue to actually over time drive people, even if they don't have the data, to at least do make sure they've picked their focal targets and have some sense of how their focal targets are doing over time. Maybe that's just a rough, spitball to start with, and maybe it works towards more effective, more rigorous ways of doing that, or maybe it works on local and indigenous knowledge. Or I think there's many ways we can get there, but it's getting this structured thinking into this conversation about effectiveness that's so important. Giselle.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get what you said, David, and I think the issue here becomes like the level of evidence, that if you're doing such an assessment at all these levels, that you have to be able to provide, that level of evidence that came forth? Was it just someone's best guess? Was it, expert opinion? Was it through hard data? Because then that gives you the context and gives that playing field that people that are data rich or data poor can still go through this process and learn from each other, even if it's based on, little e versus big E. One of the questions I had, Nick, so is this getting at, because I was just trying, because you presented a lot of information, is one of the struggles that people have is like, how do you assess how well things are going at multiple scales? And someone can say, well, I'm not doing well, but they want to have that context of the why. And so is that why you have the first part, which is easy ways to get at implementation? Like you had strategies and like maybe the why is because you didn't implement well. Is that why you have all these different components? Because that's what people resist in, large scale health assessments or multi, protected area health assessments.
So I don't have a ton of time to go into this, Giselle, but I can help share this with you much longer. We've actually developed a game that helps people assess effectiveness and understand what it is. But to me, there's a difference between, for example, so if you look at these enabling conditions, does the site have sufficient long-term political support? Does it have sustainable funding secured? Does it have sufficient staff and technical capacity? Because if the answer here is no, then yeah, we understand why you're not implementing your, if you're not getting your outside funding, well, yeah, you're not implementing your strategies, but it's for a reason that, going back to pause and reflect, we know why, right? Because you didn't have the support. It's not your fault. It's your boss's fault.
Right.
So yes, that's what we're trying to get at.
Yeah. Okay.
No, Nick, but I really want to congratulate both of you that I always loved that one of the first things we did at CMP back in 2003 was the Rosetta Stone, because it was really important. And I congratulate both of you on doing this for the current frameworks that are being touted on looking at effectiveness, because we ended up with having I don't know, framework soup where there was just a whole bunch of them and nobody really could grasp what was the yes. And what I think what CMP did with our Rosetta Stone was get people to use a common language, which was incredibly important. And Nick and Paola, I think this effort by you guys is taking us in that same direction where, as you said, Nick, we can influence through this process, one hopes, the development of a common language around measuring effectiveness. Excellent work. Really, really super stuff.
Yeah, John, you asked if it's public. I just put the link here in the chat so you can get to this. And this is the Rosetta Stone. It's got the original order and then it's got the crosswalk. The crosswalk's pretty hard to read. It's pretty messy. At some point we'll have to make it a much cleaner thing for people to publish and understand.
Appreciate it. Thank you.